Imagine seeing a Nazi propaganda poster labeled "The Ideal German Soldier." Now imagine discovering that soldier was half Jewish. Or picture a Luftwaffe field marshal helping build Hitler's war machine while his own father was a Jewish pharmacist. What if I told you that approximately 150,000 men with Jewish ancestry fought for Nazi Germany? Sounds impossible, right? But it happened. This is the untold story of Hitler's Jewish soldiers, and it's far stranger than fiction. History is rarely as black and white as we'd like to believe. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in one of the most paradoxical chapters of World War II, the story of men with Jewish ancestry who served in Adolf Hitler's armed forces. Yes, you heard that correctly. Soldiers with Jewish blood fought for the Third Reich, wore the swastika on their uniforms, and in some cases rose to the highest ranks of Nazi Germany's military machine. Today, we're diving deep into this uncomfortable and complex historical reality. We'll explore how this came to be, who these men were, and what their stories tell us about the twisted logic of Nazi racial ideology. This is the story of Hitler's Jewish soldiers. Before we begin, if you enjoy detailed historical content like this, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you more stories like this one. To understand how Jewish soldiers could exist in Hitler's army, we first need to understand the bizarre and contradictory world of Nazi racial classification. Adolf Hitler had never hidden his hatred for the Jewish people. In Mein Kampf, written years before he came to power, he laid out his vision of a Germany purged of Jewish influence. This wasn't just political rhetoric, it was a blueprint for systematic persecution. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, he wasted no time in translating his hatred into action. The Nazi regime began a campaign of violence, intimidation, and legal persecution against Germany's Jewish population. Jewish businesses were boycotted, Jewish professionals were barred from their occupations, and Jewish children were expelled from schools. The message was clear. Jews had no place in the new Germany. But the Nazis didn't stop at simple persecution. They needed to define, scientifically and legally, who exactly was a Jew and who was not. This wasn't as straightforward as it might seem. Germany had been home to a Jewish population for over 1,000 years. Intermarriage, conversion, and assimilation had created countless families with mixed heritage. The Nazi obsession with racial purity demanded a systematic classification of every German citizen's bloodline. This led to the promulgation of the Nuremberg Laws in September 1935. These laws, officially titled the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, formed the legal foundation of Nazi racial policy. They defined who was Aryan and who was not, and they did so with a level of bureaucratic detail that would have been comical if it weren't so tragically consequential. The Nuremberg laws forbade marriage and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. They stripped Jews of German citizenship, reducing them to the status of subjects. But most importantly for our story, they created a complex hierarchy of racial classification that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of Germans. The Nazi racial bureaucrats faced a problem. What about the children of mixed marriages? What about people who had one Jewish grandparent or one Jewish great-grandparent? The solution was the creation of the Mischling classification system, Mischling being the German word for mixed race, though it also translates as mongrel, revealing the contempt built into the very terminology. At the top of the racial hierarchy were the Deutschblütiger, the German-blooded. These were people with 4 Aryan grandparents, considered racially pure Germans, and granted full Reich citizenship with all its rights and protections. Interestingly, people who were 1/8 Jewish, meaning they had one Jewish great-grandparent, were also classified as German-blooded. In the Nazi view, one Jewish great-grandparent diluted the bloodline enough to be acceptable. Next came the Mischling categories. Mischling of the second degree were those who were 1/4 Jewish, having one Jewish grandparent. These individuals could retain German citizenship, though they faced various restrictions depending on the whims of local authorities and the progression of Nazi policy. Then there were the Mischling of the first degree, the most significant category for our story. These were people who were either 3/8 or half Jewish. They had either one Jewish grandparent and one half-Jewish parent, or two Jewish grandparents. Despite this substantial Jewish ancestry, they could still be approved for German citizenship under certain circumstances. Finally, anyone who was 3/4 or fully Jewish was classified simply as Jewish, designated as race enemies, and subjected to the full force of Nazi persecution. To prove their status, every German citizen was required to obtain a German blood certificate, the Ahnenpass or ancestry passport. This document traced family lineage back multiple generations and became one of the most important papers a person could possess in Nazi Germany. Your blood certificate could determine whether you lived or died. The classifications split families down the middle. A household might contain both German citizens and Jews. As persecution intensified and then escalated into the horror of the Holocaust, families were literally torn apart. German citizens watched as their Jewish relatives were deported to concentration camps, powerless to intervene, or in some tragic cases, unwilling to risk their own status to help. So how did men with Jewish ancestry end up serving in Hitler's armed forces? The answer lies in the complexity of the Mischling classification system and the contradictions inherent in Nazi ideology. Many Mischling men of the first and second degree were classified as German citizens. As such, they were subject to the same obligations as any other German man, including military conscription. When Germany began its rearmament in the mid-1930s and eventually went to war in 1939, the Wehrmacht needed soldiers, lots of them, and Mischling men, particularly those of the second degree, were drafted into service alongside their fully Aryan comrades. But it wasn't just conscription. Many Mischling soldiers volunteered to serve. This might seem shocking, but we need to understand their perspective. Many of these men didn't consider themselves Jewish at all. They had been raised as Christians, identified as Germans, and in some cases didn't even know about their Jewish ancestry until the Nuremberg laws forced families to confront their genealogies. Some came from families that had converted to Christianity generations earlier. Others were the products of interfaith marriages where the Jewish parent had converted before or after marriage. In many cases, these families had been thoroughly assimilated into German Christian society for decades. They celebrated Christmas, attended Lutheran churches, and had no connection to Jewish religious or cultural practices. For these men, the discovery of Jewish ancestry was often unwelcome and confusing. Their entire identity as Germans was suddenly called into question by a regime that defined identity purely through bloodline. Some responded by actively rejecting their Jewish heritage, officially distancing themselves from Jewish mothers or grandparents, and emphasizing their German and Christian identity. They saw military service as a way to prove their loyalty to Germany and protect themselves and their families from persecution. The numbers are staggering. Historians have calculated that approximately 150,000 men with Jewish ancestry served in the German armed forces during World War II. Think about that for a moment. That's roughly the equivalent of 10 Wehrmacht divisions worth of soldiers who, under Nazi ideology, carried the blood of the regime's primary enemy. These men served in every branch of the military. They were in the Wehrmacht infantry divisions, the Kriegsmarine Navy, the Luftwaffe Air Force, and even, incredibly, in the SS, which had the strictest racial requirements of any Nazi organization. They fought on every front, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin. Some were decorated for bravery. Some were promoted to high rank. Some were killed in action, dying for a regime that defined them as racial inferiors. This uncomfortable arrangement couldn't last forever. In April 1940, following the successful invasion of Poland and on the eve of the campaign against France, Hitler issued a directive that would upend the lives of thousands of soldiers. The order mandated the expulsion of all Mischling of the first degree from the armed forces. Men who were half Jewish were to be dismissed from military service immediately. The timing is significant. By 1940, the regime was growing more confident and more radical in its racial policies. The early days of consolidating power were over. The Wehrmacht had proven itself in Poland. Hitler felt secure enough to purge the army of what he saw as racial contamination, even at the cost of losing trained soldiers. The order created chaos. Thousands of soldiers, many of whom were serving on the front lines, suddenly found their status in question. Men who had fought for Germany, some who had been wounded or decorated for bravery, were being told they were no longer worthy to wear the uniform. For many, this wasn't just a professional disaster, but an existential threat. Being expelled from the army meant losing the protection that military service provided. It made them and their families more vulnerable to persecution by the Gestapo and SS. This led to a desperate scramble by affected soldiers and their families to find ways around the order. Those with connections to powerful Nazis sought intervention. Others attempted to have their racial classifications changed, producing documents, affidavits, and testimonies that would prove they weren't as Jewish as their family trees suggested. Some succeeded through legitimate means, discovering records that showed mistakes in their genealogy. Others resorted to forgery, falsification, and outright lies. The Nazi bureaucracy, always eager to maintain its meticulous records, created an exception process. Soldiers could apply for what was known as Deutschblutigkeit, or German-bloodedness, a special dispensation that would override their Mischling classification. But obtaining this required either proof that the genealogical records were wrong, or, more commonly, intervention by someone with enough power to overrule the system. This is where the stories get truly bizarre and revealing about the nature of Nazi power structures. The regime that claimed to operate according to scientific racial principles regularly ignored its own rules when it suited powerful individuals or practical military needs. Let's examine one of the most ironic cases from this period. Werner Goldberg, the man whose face became the symbol of the ideal German soldier. Goldberg's story perfectly encapsulates the contradictions and tragedies of the Mischling experience. Werner was born in 1919 to a family that, on the surface, appeared thoroughly German and Christian. His father had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism years earlier, so he could marry Werner's mother, who was Christian. Werner and his brother were baptized as Lutherans from birth. They were raised in the Lutheran faith, attending church and celebrating Christian holidays. They had no connection to Jewish religion or culture. The family's Jewish heritage was essentially a secret, one that even Werner didn't know about during his childhood. It wasn't until 1935, when the Nuremberg laws came into effect, that the truth emerged. Werner's father lost his job because of his Jewish ancestry, and suddenly the family had to confront a reality they had successfully hidden or ignored for decades. Werner, just 16 years old, discovered he was classified as a Mischling of the first degree. He was half Jewish in the eyes of the law, even though he had never identified as Jewish or even known about his heritage. Despite this revelation, Werner Goldberg's life continued on a surprisingly normal trajectory for a young German man of that era. In 1938, he was called up for service in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, a mandatory 6-month stint of public works that all young German men had to complete before military service. He served without incident, and when war broke out in 1939, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht. Goldberg served during the invasion of France in 1940, part of the Lightning Campaign that brought Nazi Germany to the height of its power. He was, by all accounts, a good soldier, disciplined and competent. and he was photogenic. Somewhere along the line, likely during or shortly after the French campaign, a photograph of Werner Goldberg in his Wehrmacht uniform was taken. The photo showed a young man with striking features, light hair, blue eyes, and a strong jawline. He looked every bit the Aryan ideal. The photograph came to the attention of the Nazi propaganda machine. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, was always looking for images to use in recruiting campaigns and to promote the image of German martial superiority. Goldberg's photo was perfect. It was used in newspapers, recruiting posters, and propaganda materials under the banner, "The Ideal German Soldier." The irony was lost on Goebbels and the propaganda ministry. They had no idea that their ideal German soldier was a Mischling with Jewish ancestry. But Hitler's April 1940 order meant that Werner Goldberg's time in uniform was limited. As a Mischling of the first degree, he was expelled from the Wehrmacht. However, Goldberg was fortunate. He wasn't sent to a concentration camp or left without protection. Instead, he found employment as a teacher for the Reich Committee for Labor Studies, a position that kept him relatively safe and, crucially, allowed him to shield his father from the Gestapo. Using his position and connections, Werner managed to keep his father protected through the war years. This was no small feat. By the early 1940s, the deportations had begun. Jews and those classified as Jews were being sent to ghettos in the East, and then to the death camps. Being able to keep his father safe required constant vigilance, careful navigation of the Nazi bureaucracy, and no small amount of luck. The protection worked. Werner Goldberg and his father survived the war, making them the only members of their immediate family to do so. Other relatives perished in the Holocaust. After the war, Werner Goldberg built a new life in West Germany, eventually becoming involved in politics. He lived a long life, dying in Berlin in 2004 at the age of 84. The photograph of him as the ideal German soldier remains one of the most powerful symbols of the contradictions and ironies of Nazi racial ideology. If Werner Goldberg's story is ironic, the case of Luftwaffe General Erhard Milch is almost beyond belief. Milch rose to become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, a field marshal and inspector general of the Luftwaffe, despite having a Jewish father. His story reveals how the Nazi racial system could be manipulated by those with power and connections. Erhard Milch was born in 1892, the son of Anton Milch, a Jewish pharmacist, and his wife Clara, who was not Jewish. Under the Nuremberg laws, this made Erhard a Mischling of the first degree, half Jewish. But by the time these laws were enacted, Milch was already a significant figure in German aviation. He had served as a pilot and observer in World War I, and after the war, he became a major figure in the development of German civil aviation, serving as head of Lufthansa, Germany's national airline. When Hitler came to power, Hermann Göring, who had been appointed to head the new German Air Force, recognized Milch's talent and expertise. Göring brought Milch into the Luftwaffe as his deputy, placing him in charge of organizing and building the new Air Force. Milch proved brilliant at the task, overseeing the rapid expansion of German air power in the 1930s. But there was a problem. The Gestapo, always zealous in hunting down Jewish ancestry, began investigating Milch's background in the 1930s. They quickly discovered that his father was Jewish, making Milch ineligible for his position and, under the increasingly harsh racial laws, potentially subject to persecution. This is where Hermann Göring demonstrated the real nature of Nazi power. It was personal, arbitrary, and utterly cynical. Göring needed Milch. The Luftwaffe was his power base, his pride and joy, and Milch was essential to building it into the force Göring envisioned. So Göring decided to simply change Milch's racial status. He obtained an affidavit from Milch's mother, Clara, claiming that Erhard's real father was not Anton Milch, but Clara's own uncle. In other words, Clara testified that Erhard was the product of incest with her uncle, not the legitimate son of her Jewish husband Anton. It was a lie, almost certainly concocted with Clara's cooperation to save her son. But the Nazi bureaucracy accepted it. Why? Because Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in Germany and Hitler's designated successor, said it was true. Göring famously declared, "I will decide who is a Jew and who is not." And he did. Based on Clara's affidavit, Erhard Milch was issued a German blood certificate showing him to be 100% Aryan. Think about the implications. The Nazi regime, which claimed to operate according to scientific principles of racial purity, found testimony of incest more acceptable than Jewish ancestry. A story of a woman having a child with her uncle was preferable to the straightforward truth that a talented officer had a Jewish father. It reveals the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of Nazi racial ideology. The rules applied when the rulers wanted them to apply, and were ignored when they were inconvenient. Armed with his new Aryan certification, Milch continued his rise through the Luftwaffe hierarchy. He became a general, then a field marshal, one of the highest ranks in the German military. He was responsible for aircraft production, a crucial role as the war progressed and Germany's Air Force faced increasing pressure from Allied bombing campaigns and combat losses. But Milch's story doesn't end with military success. His role in the Nazi war machine would ultimately lead to his downfall. In 1947, Milch was tried by the Americans as a war criminal. The charges against him were serious: mistreatment of forced laborers and prisoners of war, and crimes against humanity, including the use of Jewish slave labor in aircraft factories. The trial revealed the dark side of Milch's efficiency. The aircraft production he oversaw was built on the backs of concentration camp prisoners, POWs, and forced laborers who worked under brutal conditions. Many died from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. Milch was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, as with many Nazi war criminals, Milch's sentence was eventually reduced. His life sentence was commuted to 15 years, and he was released in 1954 after serving just 7 years. He lived quietly in Dusseldorf until his death in 1972 at the age of 80. He was the last surviving field marshal from Hitler's regime. The man who had been declared Aryan despite his Jewish father outlived all his fully Aryan peers among Germany's highest military ranks. Perhaps the most shocking case of all involves Emil Maurice, a man who was not just a Michelin serving in the Nazi system, but a member of Hitler's inner circle and an officer in the SS, the organization with the strictest racial requirements in all of Nazi Germany. Emil Maurice was born in 1897 in Westermoor, Germany. He became involved with Adolf Hitler very early in the Nazi movement, joining the party in 1919, just months after its founding when it was still called the German Workers' Party. Maurice wasn't just an early member, he was part of Hitler's intimate circle. He served as Hitler's personal chauffeur, one of his bodyguards, and was a founding member of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or Protection Squadron, which began as Hitler's personal security detail. Maurice participated in the infamous Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, the failed coup attempt in Munich that landed Hitler and many other Nazi leaders in Landsberg prison. For his role in this event, Maurice was awarded the Blood Order, one of the most prestigious decorations in the Nazi Party, given only to those who participated in the putsch. He was Hitler's friend and confidant during those crucial early years when the Nazi movement was still small and scrappy. But in 1935, everything changed for Maurice. He applied to marry, and as an SS officer, he was required to provide Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, with a complete family tree dating back to 1750. This was standard practice for SS officers. The SS prided itself on being the racial elite of Nazi Germany, and members had to prove absolutely pure Aryan ancestry. When Maurice's family tree was examined, a problem emerged. He had a Jewish great-grandfather, Under the Nuremberg laws, this technically made him only 1/8 Jewish, which would normally classify him as German-blooded and eligible for Reich citizenship. However, the SS had far stricter standards. For the SS, any Jewish ancestry whatsoever was disqualifying. Even one Jewish great-grandfather made Maurice racially unacceptable. Heinrich Himmler, fanatical about racial purity and eager to enforce SS standards, demanded Maurice's expulsion from the organization. This put Hitler in an awkward position. Maurice had been with him from the beginning, had shared a prison cell with him after the beer hall putsch, and was one of the old fighters who formed the core of Hitler's support. Expelling Maurice would be a personal betrayal of a loyal friend. Hitler chose loyalty over ideology. He intervened personally on Maurice's behalf, declaring that Emil and his brothers were to be considered honorary Aryans. It was an extraordinary move, revealing that even Hitler himself was willing to bend or break the racial rules for personal reasons. Maurice and his brothers received German blood certificates, their Jewish ancestry officially overlooked, and Maurice remained in the SS. But Maurice's career path changed after this incident. While he remained an SS officer, he also transferred to the Luftwaffe, serving as an officer in the Air Force during World War II. He eventually reached the rank of Oberfuhrer in the SS, equivalent to a senior colonel or brigadier general, a remarkable achievement for someone who technically shouldn't have been in the organization at all. Maurice survived the war, but his Nazi past caught up with him during the denazification process. He spent 4 years in a labor camp and had 30% of his assets confiscated as punishment for his role in the Nazi regime. He was luckier than many former SS officers who faced execution or much longer imprisonment for war crimes. Maurice had managed to avoid the worst of the criminal activity that many SS men participated in, or at least avoided being prosecuted for it. He lived the rest of his life in Munich, dying in 1972 at the age of 75. His story stands as perhaps the most extreme example of how Nazi racial ideology could be set aside when it suited Hitler's personal interests. The man who wrote in Mein Kampf about the dangers of racial mixing made exceptions for his friends. The story of Hitler's Jewish soldiers is one of the most paradoxical chapters in World War II history. These men, approximately 150,000 of them, lived in a twilight zone between persecution and privilege, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected by the Nazi regime. Their experiences reveal fundamental truths about Nazi Germany that we sometimes forget. First, Nazi racial ideology, despite all its pretensions to scientific rigor, was fundamentally arbitrary and flexible. The complex Michelin classification system created a bureaucratic nightmare that produced absurd situations where brothers might be classified differently, where families were split between citizens and race enemies, and where a person's status could change based on a newly discovered document or a powerful patron's intervention. Second, power in Nazi Germany was personal rather than institutional. The cases of Erhard Milch and Emil Maurice show that rules, even fundamental racial rules, could be overridden by powerful individuals. Hermann Göring really could decide who was a Jew and who wasn't, at least within his sphere of influence. Hitler could declare someone an honorary Aryan on the basis of personal loyalty. The regime that claimed to operate according to natural law and racial science was actually a system of personal patronage and arbitrary power. Third, identity is complex and fluid. Many Michelin soldiers genuinely didn't identify as Jewish. They had been raised as Christians, thought of themselves as Germans, and had no connection to Jewish religion or culture. The Nazis tried to reduce identity to bloodline, to make it a purely biological fact, but human identity doesn't work that way. A person can be Jewish by ancestry, but not by culture, religion, or self-understanding. The Michelin experience also raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and survival. Were these men victims of the Nazi regime, forced to serve a system that persecuted their relatives? Or were they collaborators who joined the regime to save themselves? The answer, frustratingly, is both. They were simultaneously victims and participants, persecuted and protected, German soldiers and Jewish descendants. Some Mischling soldiers actively distanced themselves from their Jewish heritage, rejecting Jewish relatives and emphasizing their German identity. This was sometimes a survival strategy, but it also represented genuine belief. They really did see themselves as Germans first and foremost. Can we judge them harshly for trying to survive in impossible circumstances? Or should we condemn them for serving a regime that murdered millions of their Jewish cousins? These questions don't have easy answers. History rarely does, despite our desire for clear moral lessons. The story of Hitler's Jewish soldiers reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, human behavior is complicated, contradictory, and often impossible to categorize neatly as good or evil. What happened to most of these men after the war? Many simply disappeared back into civilian life, their Mischling status often hidden or forgotten in the chaos of post-war Germany. Some, like Werner Goldberg, built successful careers in the new German democracy. Others faced questions and accusations about their wartime service. A few, like Erhard Milch, were prosecuted for war crimes. The historical record on these men remained largely hidden for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that serious scholarly work began examining the phenomenon of Mischling soldiers. The research revealed the astonishing scope of Jewish ancestry in the Wehrmacht and the complex ways individuals and families navigated the Nazi racial system. Today, the story of Hitler's Jewish soldiers serves as a powerful reminder that history is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be. We want clear narratives of good versus evil, heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. But the reality is messy, complicated, and morally ambiguous. The Mischling soldiers embodied all of these contradictions. They were soldiers in an evil regime and sometimes victims of that same regime. They were Germans by culture and Jews by ancestry. They fought for a system that defined them as inferior. They wore the swastika while their relatives were murdered in death camps. Some helped build the Nazi war machine, while others subtly resisted from within. Some survived because of their service, while others saw their families destroyed despite it. Their story doesn't change the fundamental evil of the Nazi regime or diminish the horror of the Holocaust. But it does add another layer of complexity to our understanding of that period. It shows how ordinary people tried to survive in extraordinary and horrific circumstances, making impossible choices with no good options. Perhaps the final lesson is this: systems of classification and division, whether based on race, religion, ethnicity, or any other category, always fail to capture the complexity of human identity and experience. The Nazis tried to create a scientifically ordered racial hierarchy, but they ended up with a bureaucratic mess that contradicted itself at every turn. They tried to divide people cleanly into categories, but reality refused to cooperate. The existence of 150,000 soldiers with Jewish ancestry in Hitler's armies is a testament to the failure of Nazi racial ideology and a reminder that human beings are far more complex, contradictory, and interesting than any system of classification can capture. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's lesser-known stories. And remember, the best way to honor history is to understand it in all its complexity, even when that complexity makes us uncomfortable.